Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Monday, February 5th, 2024. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Steven Friedman, director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the Assault on Meaning. Also on the program today, U.S. strikes over 85 targets on Friday in Iraq and Syria, supposedly against Iran proxies. Meanwhile, massive life-threatening flooding in Los Angeles as wildfires rage in Chile with over 100 dead there. Negotiations continue on a temporary truce as Israel weighs extending its ground assault to southernmost tip of Gaza. Senate border and supplemental deal released. It's DOA already in the House. Biden wins in South Carolina, yet polling still dismal for him as his political operation believes it's probably a lack of information. Newton teacher strike ends with a teacher and student win there. Minneapolis teachers stage a walkout over a lack of contract, and Vegas hotel workers decide today that they may strike, and they may be joined on the picket line by Joe Biden. Meanwhile, Mike Johnson says he will bring a vote on an Israel-only aid bill this week. Boeing finds a new problem with the 737 fuselage.
Jeez.
Just some misplaced drilling. And Tesla has to recall another 2.2 million cars. All this and more on today's Majority Report.
It's so weird that Tesla has to recall all these cars when they didn't have any DEI programs. Sorry, I jumped the gun.
That's a good point, though.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I have to anticipate the objection that Tesla nerds will say, which is that, it's actually an over-the-air recall, which means it's like a software update. But, I think...
No, but this is not the only one.
No, of course. No, this happens all the time to significant, almost like catastrophically significant things.
Yes.
And yeah, there should be much more oversight about things like that, and whether the blinkers work and that sort of thing.
Apparently, I also have to say that I did not just pass gas at the beginning of the show.
Whoa!
I blew my nose.
Oh, I thought you must have had your cough button on. You went full nose blow.
The cough button's out the window.
Mic on.
Yeah, the cough button has not been...
What happened to that cough button? You haven't used it since COVID.
Well, I got it disconnected because we thought it might be causing a problem with the thing. I guess I got to redo that thing.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So I just wanted to...
I'm glad you corrected the record.
Well, I get a bunch of IMs and people are like, get Sam some Flonase. I don't know what's going on. It just sort of is a recent development, just in the past couple of moments. A lot to get to. This border deal is it's one of those situations where, and if you have been following politics over the past 20, 25 years, you will have seen many instances where Democrats think that if they capitulate to Republican desires, that they will get credit for either that capitulation or the failure of Republicans to say yes. And this is one of those instances. Now, Joe Biden is a cipher on just about every issue, except for apparently whether Palestinians are people and Israel should continue their assault on Gaza. But aside from that, he is a cipher and tries to find the middle of the Democratic Party. But I'm not convinced that even this proposal is the middle of the Democratic Party. There has been no attempt by the Democratic Party to articulate a counter narrative to the Republican idea that the border is in crisis. There is no doubt that we don't have the amount of resources we need to process people. And there is a fear amongst the administration in pushing for the ability of people who are here. And let's be clear, if you enter this country and seek asylum, you are not here illegally. You are here and are awaiting an asylum hearing under both international and U.S. law. That's just the fact. If you enter this country without seeking asylum, without documents, it is still a civil violation. It's not a criminal one. And so the Biden administration simply wants to sort of essentially squeeze the standards for what you are worthy of getting a second hearing beyond a preliminary hearing on your asylum claim, and just narrow essentially the across the board the criteria for this type of thing. I mean, that's just broad strokes. He signaled that he would sign this back when he thought this was a way of getting like a twofer. This is the way we'll get our Ukraine aid and our Israel aid, and also a way in which we will show that we're addressing the border. But none of that's working. Now, of course, in the meantime, we have the trucker convoy that is going down to fight a holy war at the border or on behalf of the state of Texas, I guess. There was they stopped about 15, 20 miles from the border, from the Shelby Park, but some of the border convoy people went all the way to the park to check it out and anticipating the invasion that they keep hearing about. Now, the reason why they believe that there's an invasion, put aside whether some people are a little more receptive than others to believing absolute backcrap, crazy things, which I think is in this the case in this instance. But there is zero pushback. There is zero pushback in our media, by our political class. I mean, look, it would be great if we had a media that was going to just simply choose that this is a political issue. Let's go down there and do some reporting, and we'll spend our time talking about just simply the reality. But that's not it. The way that our media works is that there are two sides in an argument, and they cover that argument. And if one side doesn't make an argument, then all of the coverage is on the side that is making an argument, regardless of how insane it is. So even these lunatics who went down to Eagle Pass to see the border with their own eyes, to steel themselves to the massive invasion that was taking place, they're like, it wasn't really what I thought it was going to be. I saw a couple of people, a family, walk across a river.
I've been talking to these folks who have come from all over Texas, even other parts of the country, to be here. And some of them, even though we are about a half hour from Eagle Pass, have driven down to Eagle Pass to try to actually see what's happening at the border. And I've spoken to a number of people who said that they're a little surprised by what they're seeing here. I want to play a conversation with a woman, Misty. Take a listen.
It's pretty surreal. We actually made it into Eagle Pass and we went and saw Shelby Park. I was able to see some people actually trying to cross and stopped at the wire there. So it's very eye-opening.
And tell me more about eye-opening. Is it what you expected? Is it better? Is it worse?
It's not what I expected, but then again, I don't know what I expected. I can tell you it's not as bad as what I thought. So that's kind of eye-opening in itself too. Yeah.
I've been talking.
Yeah.
Should be.
Well,
least.
I mean, what would you expect What would it take? What would your expectations have to be for you to get into a convoy to go and stop this invasion of our country? You'd have to expect that it was like an invasion of our country.
Yeah. I mean, this border deal that you were alluding to is really, really bad. The thing that could save us from it is the insanity of the Republicans in the House.
100%. This is exactly like the same deal that the Obama administration wanted to make.
Right.
Largely, I think, championed by Joe Biden at the time, to cut the cost of living increases for Social Security recipients and essentially giving the Republicans the first cut to Social Security that they it's been in years and years, I mean, decades and decades.
Yeah.
And, but fortunately for normal people, the Republicans would not take yes for an answer. And it seems that they are going to be doing the exact same thing in this instance.
I hope that's the case. And then you also had Jayapal came out with a pretty strong statement about it, which is exactly what you were saying. And, you know, as the chair of the Progressive Caucus, that's important to note. Like, this is not about militarizing the border. That makes it incredibly unsafe and people drown and die. It also gives more power to cartels for their smuggling operations where they can exploit more people trying to come over. When you get rid of legal points of entry, you make illegal ones more robust in the marketplace, and that it creates a lot of danger for people if they're so worried about fentanyl and the cartels as well. But the thing that was the most scary to me is this bill has creates this power for the federal government to subvert asylum protections, basically giving them a discretionary, well, there's two parts. There's the discretionary power for the emergency authority to reject migrants on using that Title 42 framework. And then there's one where it kicks in if crossings reach 5,000 over 7 days or 8,500 in a day, then you automatically have to use this like Title 42 expulsion processing trigger. So like it basically gives the president the Title 42 authority, superseding international law asylum and domestic asylum laws, and it's for the federal government regardless of who the administration is. But like Trump could
you
win.
You don't have to worry about that.
I know.
Because it's always going to be the president you want it to be.
Well, that's the point,
and there's
right?
always going to be someone who you can trust.
That's
with
what
that
I've learned about politics.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, this is the conversation that we were having with like the Iraq War, with the AUMF. Like the Democrats love process and they love the guardrails of the Constitution when it's something that they don't want to do, like Biden spending months and months debating whether or not he had the authority to cancel student debt. But when it's something that he wants to do, there are clear constitutional issues here, but who cares?
Yes.
And I don't care as well as at creating a legal structure for a Republican crazy person to come in and use it without any guardrails whatsoever. It really is like, if this passes, this would be our first major legislation about immigration since the 90s, and it's as far right as you really could possibly go under a Democratic president. But
so far,
but we'll see. I mean, it doesn't seem like it'll pass the House, but
it's not going to pass. And again, maybe the reason why they're doing this is let's call their bluff. But the problem with this, and that's the best case scenario.
Yeah,
that's the best case scenario. The problem with that theory is, of course, that you're just moving, or at least the perception of the politics of it, to the right.
Yeah, I'm calling a Flames bluff by blowing on it.
Exactly.
And Jake Sherman from Punchbowl just now, like 5 minutes ago, said in a new statement from Mike Johnson, Steve Scalise, Tom Emmer, and Elise Stefanik, any consideration of the Senate bill in its current form is a waste of time. It is dead on arrival in the House. We encourage the U.S. Senate to reject it.
And that's, ultimately because Donald Trump basically said, I want this as an issue in the campaign. And so the Biden administration said, oh, well, in that case, let's see if we can't make it an even more winning issue for you. That's essentially what happened here. There's a massive problem that has taken place under our administration. It's a crisis. It's horrible. Here's a fix for it. And then the Republicans just say, like, it's not the right fix. But now you've ceded the entire issue to the Republicans on their grounds, in their assessment, and that's where we are. So, that's the end of that. And in the meantime, Mike Johnson's going to put up a standalone aid for Israel that Democrats, you will see, I don't know what percentage of Democrats in the House. I mean, you've got literally $100 million being dumped into a couple of races on people who speak out against this type of thing in the Democratic Party. Bowman's opponent, I think I mentioned the other day, the number one donor to Jamal Bowman's primary challenger in his primary is AIPAC. So this is the dynamic that's going on right now. It's a mess. In a minute, we're going to be talking to Steven Friedman, director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the Assault on Meaning. First, a word from our sponsor. You know how much I value a good night's sleep. Doesn't always happen in my home, but I do my best. My sheets are not going to keep me from Saul waking me up at times, but my sheets are completely set to help me sleep well. Why? Temperature regulation, ladies and gentlemen. I sleep hot, or I used to, but on Cozy Earth's luxury bedding, I don't. Why? Because of Viscose. It is it's basically from bamboo.
Yeah.
I don't know why that makes it temperature regulating, but it does. Thanks to Cozy Earth for sponsoring this episode. And they're offering you up to 35% off at CozyEarth.com. Enter Majority Report at checkout. Not only is Viscose from bamboo temperature regulating, it's also incredibly sustainable because it's bamboo. It's like literally like a weed. But I've got Cozy Earth sheets and the pillowcases, and I also have a bunch of Cozy Earth like loungewear, like joggers that are fantastic, like a loungy shirt. I love this stuff. And Cozy Earth was founded to transform people's lives by offering the softest, most luxurious, and, like I said, responsibly sourced bedding in the world. Cozy Earth is the brand that made Oprah's Favorite Things 5 years in a row. I wonder if anything else has ever done that. I don't know. And like I said, because it's premium viscose from bamboo, it is ethically sourced and highly sustainable. Cozy Earth bedding is naturally temperature regulating, and Cozy Earth bedding comes with a 100-night sleep trial, which means you have up to 100 nights to sleep on them, wash them, try them out, and if you're not completely in love with them, just return them in 100 days for a full refund. That's sort of nuts.
Great deal.
You have a duvet.
I have the duvet. Yeah, it's very helpful.
And all of their products include a 10-year warranty against defects, and I can tell you, as someone who had one pair of sheets for years and years and years until they literally evaporated, that is a great deal. Whether it's the luxury bedding, their ultra comfortable loungewear, they got also plush bath towels. You can make your new year cozier with Cozy Earth. If you've never tried Cozy Earth, I've got some awesome news. You can save up to 35% off Cozy Earth right now. But hurry, this offer will not last. Go to CozyEarth.com, enter my promo code Majority Report at checkout for up to 35% off your first order. That's CozyEarth.com, promo Majority Report. All right, going to take a quick break. When we come back, Steven Friedman, director of the Center for Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the Assault on Meaning. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Steven Friedman, director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the Assault on Meaning. Steven, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Let's just start with where this, what was the genesis of this book, I guess? I mean, what was it that you were, I mean, I know that some of this is, you had some personal experience with this, but broadly speaking, give us the idea of where this book was, out of which this book was born.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I did have personal experience in the sense of being criticized, as many Jews who are uncomfortable about the actions of the Israeli state are, of being a self-hating Jew and those kinds of that kind of language. But what really got me interested in this is that I monitor events on Palestine quite carefully. And I became increasingly aware that the term anti-Semitism seems to have totally lost its moorings. I mean, I was brought up at a time in which, we understood anti-Semitism to be a hatred of Jews as a people, very often a right-wing prejudice, a prejudice which tended to go together with white supremacy. And suddenly we discovered that people on the other side of the fence, people who were pressing for human rights, were suddenly being labeled anti-Semitic. And not only that, but that many of those people were Jewish. So you had the peculiar situation in which anti-racist Jews were being accused of being people who hated Jews. And what I've tried to do in the book is explain where that comes from. Because if you go back into the history of Zionism, which of course is the ideology which the Israeli state was founded on, then it becomes a lot clearer why this is happening. And the other point, which of course is particularly relevant to American audiences, is that a further peculiarity which I noticed is that some of the most clearly anti-Semitic people on the planet were also courted by the Israeli state and were firm friends of the Israeli state. And of course, I start off the book by pointing out this bizarre feature of the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th, in which, on the one hand, you had people as Trump supporters with T-shirts saying, 6 million Jews killed at Auschwitz was not enough. And at the same time, the same people were carrying Israeli flags. So, what I was trying to do is explain how it's possible for somebody to be a virulent racist who really thoroughly dislikes Jews, but a firm friend of the state of Israel.
All right, let's get to that part in a bit, but let's talk about the development of Zionism and its relationship to Jewry, and then I want to touch on the work that you cite of Mahmoud Mamdani, who might, I assume you based the title of the book, or at least as an homage to his work, on that dynamic, particularly that took place in within the European context, and the idea of Western versus non-Western people, and the different, I guess, criteria for what constitutes a war crime in those instances. But let's talk about the development of Zionism. I mean, we've talked about it a bit on this program, but not specifically in this context as a relationship to Judaism.
Very often, fervent Zionists like to insist that what Zionism is the liberation movement of the Jewish people, that it is the ideology of Jews who really are proud to be Jewish, that anybody who is not a Zionist is therefore a Jew who is embarrassed about being Jewish. And in fact, if you go back to the history, you find that precisely the opposite is the case. I mean, historically, we're talking now at the end of the 19th century when Zionism was formulated, Jews in Europe, which is where Zionism came from, Jews in Europe were, if you like, in Europe, but not of Europe. So they've been part of the European scene for centuries, but they were never really accepted by European elites as part of those societies. And we're all familiar with the quota systems at universities and the other forms of discrimination which were foisted on Jews. And the original Zionists were people who desperately wanted to become fully accepted as white Europeans. Theodor Herzl, who was who's revered today as the founder of Zionism, wrote a novel called Alt Neuland, Old New Country, in which he described this state that his movement was trying to create. And the interesting thing about this state is that, according to Herzl, its citizens would each evening get dressed up in top hat and tails and go off to the opera and would speak German. And he even added this touch, because it clearly seemed to be important to him, that they would engage in dueling, which was then very popular among the European upper class, because, as he put it, that would add some French refinement. So it's quite obvious that Herzl didn't want to create a state for Jews in the Middle East. He wanted to create a Western state in which Jews would obviously be the majority population. If you have a look at A.D. Gordon, for example, who is an Eastern European early Zionist, Gordon talked about Jews as depraved. He was horrified by Jews because both he and Herzl believed that Jews were decadent, that Jews were parasites, and that if they had a state, they would cease to be parasites. So you have this rather interesting situation in which the early Zionists are repeating the white supremacist anti-Semitism of the time. The only difference between them and the anti-Semites was that the anti-Semites said, look, Jews were born like this, it couldn't ever change, whereas the Zionist says, no, if we form a state, then we will be accepted as by the people around us. And what they meant was clearly being accepted by white Western Europeans. Of course, much the same, it was reciprocated, because particularly after the Nazi genocide had shown European elites the danger of their prejudices against Jews, they did come to see Jews, and particularly the Israeli state, as Western. I mean, just one example, which unfortunately isn't in the book because it's in a book which was published afterwards. There's a very interesting new book out on German attitudes to this question, in which the author points out that Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany after the war, told the then Israeli prime minister that, we will always support you because you are our Western representatives in the Middle East. So in a sense, what Zionism has become, and it's been successful in that, is not a passport to Jewish freedom, but a passport to Jewish Europeanness. And that, of course, is where the comparison with Mamdani, who, as you correctly say, is the inspiration for the title.
Yeah, I want to get to that. I know I want to get to that in a moment too, but it also strikes me that that is in some ways also sort of Lord Balfour's project was also perceiving Israel as an outpost. I mean, in addition, it was also sort of famously an anti-Semite, but wanted this sort of outpost for perhaps in a more sort of like practical material way. But I mean, the idea of they'll be our outpost in that region, specifically not necessarily a Western one, but one specific to Britain, as they're trying to sort of wage their, I guess, or fight their empire. And go ahead. I don't.
No, absolutely. I mean, we know that the British and the French carved up the Middle East among themselves, and the British got what was then officially Palestine. And that was, of course, part of his motivation. But Balfour had another motivation, which you've hinted at in your question, which is that Balfour was an anti-Semite. He had, a few years earlier, before issuing this declaration, introduced very tough anti-immigration laws, which he said specifically were there to prevent Jewish immigration. And as far as Balfour was concerned, not only would Britain have this outpost in the Middle East, which was a sensitive region, but it would actually get rid of lots of European Jews at the same time. And send them off to this far-off place. So there was not only a very clearly imperial intent in what Balfour was doing, but a very clear anti-Semitic intent.
It's also this importing of nationalism, European. Like you spoke about how there was, of course, the deeply racist undertones of it, but the nationalistic kind of European conception of it at the time, of having a nation defined by its people, by its culture, by these stricter definitions, also feels like a very specifically European export to what was then Palestine and is now the Israeli government at the time, which is as enduring as anything based in what we're dealing with right now with their crimes against Palestinians in Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Zionism was essentially an attempt to copy the fashionable nationalism in Europe in the later 18th century. Ironically, and that goes back to my point about Herzl, etc., most of them found traditional ways of being Jewish offensive. One of them said, they kept on saying, we've got to create this new Jew, a muscular Jew who is proud of their nation, etc. And the irony is that in the process of embracing this 19th century European ideology, they in effect threw overboard what it was like to be Jewish until then. And of course, when I say what it was like to be Jewish until then, I'm not at all saying purely, although that was for some people part of it, that there was some kind of religious affiliation, but also, there was a very strong Jewish left-wing tradition. There was a very strong Jewish cultural tradition through the Yiddish language in Europe, etc. And all of this was considered unacceptable because it didn't fit in with the nationalist project. So in effect, you took what was a complicated, which is what Jews are, a complicated mixture of a religion and an ethnic group, and you turned them into a nation, which really was something which has no roots in any strain of Jewish culture that I'm aware of.
We should also, note that, you can see it just in the context of the naming. You literally, a lot of these Zionists would change their names, leave their European names behind. I don't know what Netanyahu's original name was, but it was I don't know, it was a sort of a typical,
Eastern European
name. This is a little bit far afield, but I am just curious about this, and it's outside of what you've written, but I'm just curious as to how much of that strand of Zionism was a function of, the movement out of the ghetto and the sort of the emancipation that took place. It's really sort of noted mid 19th century in Germany, but this sort of assimilation, was this a response to the troubles of attempting to assimilate? And I'm talking, in German society at that time, in the mid 1800s, Jews were essentially given the opportunity to be close to first-class citizens outside of the Jewish ghetto. Some availed themselves of that, but there was how does that play into it? And if that's outside of your purview,
no, it's not at all. It's crucial. You're quite right. It's crucial to understanding what happened. What happened is precisely that they were trying to. Yes, it was a consequence of the relaxation of restrictions, and in theory, Jews were now welcome into the establishment. And Zionism was partly a reaction to the fact that the welcome into the establishment was more conditional than they thought. So the watershed event, which really triggered Zionism among some of the Western European intellectuals, is the Dreyfus affair. And for those who are not familiar with it, late 19th century, Dreyfus, who was a Jewish colonel in the French army, was accused of espionage and being a traitor and sent to Devil's Island. And the charges were entirely trumped up, and he was eventually released and pardoned. But the whole point of Dreyfus was that he had joined the French army and he had rank in the French army, so he was now a fully card-carrying member, if you like, of the Western European elite, and yet anti-Semites accused him of treachery, and he had to suffer for his Jewishness. And that's very clearly reflected in Herzl's writings. It's less of a factor, to be fair, in the Eastern European Zionists, because they were still living in countries which had very explicit restrictions on Jews. But certainly, Herzl, Freud, and the other Western European Zionists were very acutely influenced by this anguish at wanting to be fully card-carrying, paid-up members of the Western European elite, and being told that actually, no, they were still different from genteel people simply because they were Jewish.
Let's talk about that concept of just how much sort of the idea of being Western, the Westernization, this is as much of a Westernization project as anything else. Let's talk about the ideas that Mahmoud Mamdani wrote about, and the dynamic during World War II, the way that the Nazis perceived their actions as potential war crimes when it was in relation to those to the East, specifically the Russians, and those to the West, specifically the Western allies, and even on some level to the Jews, obviously not in what they're willing to do, but in the context in where they were willing to do it. The idea that there were no death camps in Germany per se, this had to be something that they had to sort of like outsource in some way. Discuss those ideas for us.
Yeah, I think if we want to understand that and also understand some contemporary events, Mamdani's book is like mine, very concerned about the whole question of Westernness and what that means. And one of the very forceful points he makes is that for a very long time in the West, there have been two types of wars. What he calls civilized wars and colonial wars. And civilized wars, in inverted commas, are governed by the rules of war, and colonial wars are governed by the laws of nature, which essentially means might is right. So that you look, for example, even before the Nazi genocide of the Jews and the Slavs, etc., at the turn of the 20th century, the Germans conducted a genocide in Namibia, just to the north of South Africa, in which they tried to wipe out most of the indigenous population. Of course, infamously, we know from an important study on the subject of the number of Congolese people who were wiped out by King Leopold and his emissaries. So, in other words, what happens if you're fighting other Westerners? Then you have to observe the Geneva Conventions and you have to behave yourself. If you're fighting people who are not Westerners, then that does not apply. And he argues, therefore, that the Nazi genocide was unique to Europe. The idea of trying to, this wholesale slaughter of an entire people. But it wasn't unique to the way in which Europe treated the rest of the world. So the real crime of the Nazis was not that they slaughtered millions of people, but that they slaughtered millions of European people. And even within the European understanding, there were A grade Europeans and B grade Europeans, and of course the B grade Europeans were, as you correctly say, the Russians, the Slavs, the Eastern Europeans, who were slaughtered in much the same numbers as the Jews, and in odd ways treated. I mean, if you could imagine such a thing, I point out one weird anomaly in the Second World War, which is that Jewish prisoners who served in Western armies, who were captured by the Nazis, were not slaughtered. They weren't treated always very well, but they were not wiped out. Whereas Russian prisoners of war were, because the Russians were considered beyond the pale, whereas as bigoted as they were towards Jews, a Jew who wore a British Army uniform or a French Army uniform, or later on a US Army uniform, was considered entitled to the laws of war. And of course, this is what we see at the moment, not only in Gaza, where Israeli Jews are quite rightly considered to be entitled not to be murdered when they go to pop concerts. But Palestinians are not considered to be entitled to not be murdered when they go to hospitals or schools. Even if one goes back a couple of years to the Ukraine war, Putin quite rightly is told that he can't invade Ukraine, but nobody minded when he bombed Aleppo in Syria back into the Stone Age, or where he leveled the capital of Chechnya. So you once again have this distinction of if they're white Europeans like the Ukrainians and now like the Israelis, you have to treat them as human beings with rights. If they're outside that pale, you can in effect do what you like to them. How do these sort of determinations, how do they generate and how are they sustained? I mean, I feel like, at one point, the Irish were sort of in some ways classified as as non-Europeans to some extent, that the idea of there being, rules of war amongst European countries feels like it comes from sort of like the aristocracy in the era of kings, where they were all sort of like in the same family and or extended family. And, well, this is how we achieve honor. And, we're all worthy of honor and rules, but everyone else, not so much. But what I guess created that? Was it the lack of an aristocracy in Russia at that time that allowed for the sort of, this was the rabble that was running things at that time? And how are those things coded or signified? Well, they were coded and signified by the conditions of the time. And what you're hinting at, I mean, it's a very important question, is that, look, there's very little about race, if anything, which is biological. I mean, it's all social, it's all constructed. One of the ironies about what is going on in the Middle East at the moment is that, if from afar you saw an Israeli and a Palestinian, very often you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So what happens is that these barriers are constructed by the historical circumstances of the time, by prejudices which develop among the elites. And European elites have always been quite picky about who is allowed into the club and who isn't. So what tended to happen is that people within Europe who, for historical reasons, were not as affluent then as the rest of Europe, did not have the kind of infrastructure that the rest of Europe had, were sort of, in a sense, relegated to being half European or not European at all. And the Irish are a very clear example of this. And in the, we all know that in the UK, for example, at one stage it used to be common to have signs, no dogs, no Jews, no Irish, and no blacks, of course. So what happens is that among those, and you're right, it does come, I think, originally from the whole aristocratic idea of, well, we might be in different countries, not on different sides, but we're all the same sorts of person, whereas the rest are rabble. That the definition of who is rabble tends to alter. And there have been some, which you're probably aware of, there's been some very interesting work done in the US on the extent to which the Irish who immigrated to the US were originally not regarded as white. How Italians who immigrated to the US were not regarded as white. So really, white becomes nothing to do with your biology. White becomes what the European elites at the time think is white. And certainly the Nazis didn't think that Russians were white.
What? I mean, is it the aristocracy, or is it a combination of, like, we have this notion of what, one of us is like, and that is like sort of the essence of it. But at the margins, we all live in the world and we need to make, material compromises at times. And if it's just too hard to say that these people are not white in this instance, because maybe we have some geopolitical interests, or maybe we have an enemy that is, even less white on the other side of them. I mean, is that basically how it gets constructed in that way?
It does get constructed in that way. And of course, the problem is that those who construct it usually have the means to get other people to believe them. So that, it sounds simplistic in a sense, but unfortunately it's the truth that, Marxists believed years ago that racial sentiments were just something which people had been sold in order to justify capitalism. But they are very, very tenacious, and they are very, very stubborn. If people are going through hard times, then you can sell them this kind of prejudice. And very often these prejudices are spread when people are going through hard times and when there are difficulties. And so that you hear, it's very common in incidents of racial conflict for people to say, but we've been living together for hundreds of years and we didn't have a problem. What happened? And if you go back, you usually find that what happened is that at a time in which people were hurting economically, the elites, for various reasons, told them that the reason they were in this position were the people living next door to them.
Well, that's important, I think, context, because of also you are in Johannesburg, right? Teaching. I'm not sure if you're there right now, but that's part of your background. South Africa obviously brought the genocide case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. Like, just from your perspective, what does being South African mean in this context of viewing Zionism, and why there's this historic solidarity between many people in South Africa and the Palestinian people?
Well, I think it's really because anybody, I think, who's politically conscious in South Africa, who was aware of what damage apartheid did to our society, and who perhaps at a certain age was active in fighting apartheid at the time, finds very clear parallels with the situation of the Palestinian people. I mean, no historical situation is identical to another one, but going beyond the reason I wrote this book, my own interest in this particular issue was very much stimulated by increasing similarities I noticed, not only in how Palestinians had been treated compared to how Black South Africans were treated under apartheid, but about the justifications which we use to say this is okay and we're superior to them, and therefore we're entitled to do that to them. And of course, the governing party in South Africa, the African National Congress, has links to Palestine which go back to the 1960s, because at that stage, of course, South Africa was under apartheid, and the Palestine Liberation Movement was fighting the Israeli state, and they saw tremendous parallels between the two. Those parallels, of course, were reinforced by the fact that the South African apartheid government and the Israeli government cooperated very tightly on military issues, and even on the development of a nuclear weapon for South Africa, which South Africa abandoned when it was clear that the next government would be black. So there's a very strong identification. Incidentally, just one point which I have an article coming out, hopefully in a US publication in the next while or so, which discusses the ICJ issue. And one of the points I make there, just for the edification of mainstream Americans, is that the ANC's allies in Palestine have never been Hamas. It has always been Fatah, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Ironically, the folks who the US administration says should be running Gaza. On the day in which South Africa's case was heard at the ICJ, there was a rally in Ramallah, which was addressed not by Hamas, but by Mohammed Stay, who's the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. So there's a very strong link going back ages, which is still it's an integral part of. If you are in South Africa, and I am still in South Africa. It's not uncommon for ANC politicians, governing party politicians, at various events to wear the Palestinian kafir, for example. It's very common. And if you get invited, as some of us were recently, to express our views at a meeting at the Foreign Ministry, then you discover that the Palestine ambassador is the person who's moderating the discussion, etc. So there's a very strong feeling, this Mandela quote, which you may or may not have heard, that South Africans won't be free until the Palestinians are free, is quoted regularly. But there's a very clear sense among anti-apartheid South Africans and anti-racist South Africans that there are very strong parallels, which mean that anti-apartheid sentiment obliges you to support Palestinian aspiration.
I'm also struck by at one point, and I don't know if how much of this comes from Mamdani or I can't recall, but the idea of Israel, the substitution, the sort of the fluidity of the word democracy, when really what it really is signifying is Western. Right, that Israel as a democracy is really not. It's really hard to make an argument that it is a democracy in the sense of, we have Puerto Rico, that is a territory that we control, and I think it is rare to find anybody, at least only half of the sort of the political spectrum in this country, to not acknowledge that there's no democracy there. They don't have representation. But we say the same thing about Washington, D.C. And then, to apply that standard to the literally millions of people who have no autonomy, no say in their government whatsoever, or what governs them anyways. And on some level, and I can't recall, frankly, it was how we, at least in this country, referenced South Africa. When I think of the sort of, to the extent that the U.S. was weighing in on the sort of the political pressure, Reagan was talking about constructive engagement at that time in South Africa, and the presumption being that at least it's somewhat democratic a little bit, I guess. But in fact, it really was just a question of like, it's Western. Like, you know, we go into a room and everybody looks more or less the same. And, you know, we listen to the same type of music, or we have, you know, we all have Banana Republic on the corner, whatever it is. I mean, that seems to be the notion of democracy in Western seems to be pretty interchangeable in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, and you know, that might be my next project, because most of my academic work is in fact on democracy and on democratic theory. And I'm now absolutely convinced that democracy in the Western mainstream actually means Western. It's got nothing to do with democratic society. I mean, just your point about apartheid. Yes, Reagan talked about constructive engagement, which really meant being nice to the apartheid government. But if you go back further, which people have tended to forget about, under the Nixon administration, Kissinger and various people around him produced these then classified documents, in effect saying precisely what you've just said, saying, look, you know, whether we think apartheid's a good idea or not, these are our people, there's a Western outpost, and who knows what would happen if things went wrong, and we ought to support those people. There is no doubt that the only reason, you know, the US passed legislation imposing sanctions on apartheid South Africa in the mid-1980s. And that was imposed because the American public, organized groups in America, demanded it. In Europe, the same. If you hadn't have had citizens mobilizing and demanding this change, it would never have happened, because the elites took the view, these are Westerners like us, and we will protect them. And then, of course, you know, you start talking about, well, you know, under apartheid, white South Africans had elections, and they were free and fair for 10% of the population. You know, 90% was living in trains, but you overlook that. And a lot of my work is on the way in which academics in the West see democracy, etc. You know, if you scratch the surface, it really does become they're Western like us, you know, and the kind of assumption, which is what a lot of my work is a critique of, that somehow you know, the West has perfected democracy, is highly questionable. I mean, you in the US have the situation where the presidential election is not necessarily won by the candidate with the most votes, right? Where there's voter suppression. You know,
the Senate is also uniquely anti-democratic.
You know, the English still have a hereditary House of Lords, which can veto legislation, etc. So really, you know, you've, as I say, you've got it exactly right. Democracy in this sense is, you know, like us Westerners. It's got nothing to do. I mean, you know, to me, democracy is about people's power and right to control their own lives and make choices on the issues which affect them. And it's really got nothing to do with that.
And I guess as I articulate it, I mean, the strategy that the Biden administration has pursued, at least, you know, up to this point, has certainly felt like the way that Reagan sold constructive engagement. Let's, you know, keep these people close and be nice to them, and then eventually they'll listen to us. I mean, I don't know how sincere that is, or how representative of the actual dynamic between the Biden administration and the Israelis, but that's certainly what is being sold. And frankly, I don't think it was that way with Reagan and the apartheid regime at that time either. But it's certainly the way that it's sold as an attempt to diffuse people's, you know, public response to the situation.
And I'll just add, as we talk about democracy, then Biden and the White House is also saying, well, we're going to have Saudi Arabia take over as the representatives for the Palestinian people. And there's no conversation about what these millions and millions of people want for their own self-determination, just to add to everything you guys have been saying.
No, absolutely correct. Look, I suspect that what Biden is doing in relation to Palestine at the moment is what Reagan wanted to do in relation to South African apartheid, and wasn't allowed to do. And he wasn't allowed to do it at the times because there was a UN arms embargo. So you were quite flagrantly breaking international law by selling arms to apartheid South Africa. I mean, it was done under the table, but they didn't do it publicly. I'm sure Reagan's view, looking carefully what he had to say, was, pal up with these people, tut occasionally if they do something outrageous, but don't break the friendship bond, which is really exactly what the Biden administration is doing. And of course, if you take it at face value, and I'm skeptical that we should, but just for argument's sake, it clearly never works. The only way you're going to move towards some kind of justice and some kind of resolution of in Palestine is through pressure. The Israeli state has to get to a situation where it believes that it better negotiate. Because it's having to pay a price if it doesn't.
Well, one of the fears I've had over the past 10, 15 years is, I think, probably best expressed in the question of, like, what if the apartheid government had a nuclear weapon at that time? Like, I mean, what if there was they felt that they were inoculated to some extent in terms of, like, the potential for the economic boycotts. I mean, there's a lot of American companies that were there, and major companies, and there was probably a higher degree of sensitivity on some level to the outside for economic resources. And I think there was also perhaps there's a greater critical mass in Israel amongst its citizenry in terms of this sense of, like, for lack of a better term, almost like a Masada complex. But what if the apartheid regime had a nuclear weapon at that time? Like, would we have seen the resolution that we saw?
It did have a nuclear weapon at the time. So yeah, we would have. It did have a nuclear weapon at the time. It chose not to use it. And the reason it chose not to use it is that there was no point. If the threat was external, if the threat was beyond the country's borders, then maybe they would have used it. But they were perfectly well aware that the threat was on their own doorstep. So you couldn't use that particular deterrent without wiping your own people out. I think the other factor, which does make the situation in the Israeli state more difficult now than in our situation, is that the level of interdependence was so great, despite the horrors of apartheid, etc. I mean, you could, if black people had withdrawn their labor permanently, the place would have collapsed. Everything was run by black, everything was relied on black labor, whereas that's not the same case there. And it became increasingly clear, incidentally, and I don't think we've got there in the Israel Palestine conflict yet, that also white South Africans, because of apartheid, got very comfortable. And they started realizing that actually, if things do change politically, they can carry on to, living rather well and insulating themselves to a large extent from the changes which happened. So there was never the same. I mean, there was never any sort of Masada complex, quite frankly, because I think if you'd suggested it to most white Afrikaners, they would much rather be, visiting Swiss ski resorts and buying the latest technology than sacrificing themselves.
It's fascinating stuff. Steven Friedman, director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, author of Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the assault on meaning. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to your book at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description.
Thank you, Sam. And thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will take your phone calls and do some things. I think we mentioned on Friday that what's that guy's name? Tim Heidegger has been invited onto the program. I think it's no secret that Tim and I have had some issues in the past.
Yeah.
With each other, but I'm.
This is bigger than you or him.
That's the point. Is that I'm not. I don't keep petty grudges when it comes to dealing with good journalism. And we highlighted some of the journalism Tim Heidegger did, and his journalistic team over at the Office show that he has.
We nominated it for a Polk Award.
Well, we did. The Polk people aren't necessarily always responsive, but I mean they did a great piece of journalism on the streamer, the YouTuber Tim Pool, who apparently had a gastrointestinal response to having Don Jr. on, and it happened on camera.
They did great work. They enhanced the audio. They really just were able to use high level technology.
That's what it is. It's technological journalism using like film editing.
It was forensics.
I mean, I also think there's a lot of gumshoe going on in there too that they did, but this is something that we could talk about. Anyways, the point being that I thought that would be an opportunity for me to put aside my petty grievances with Tim Heidegger and have him on the show. He will be on, what is it, on Wednesday now? Originally it was going to be Tuesday. No hard feelings that he said yes to Tuesday and then had to change. That's not, no hard feelings
We'll
there.
be flushing the hatchet.
Just want to make that clear. But he will be here on Wednesday. And so Wednesday, in the fun half, I think it's we're going to do. Folks, just another reason for you to become a member of the Majority Report. Join themajority.report.com. We'll be now. It's not going to be just some type of like softball. This is not going to be a what do you call it? A tongue bath, as the kids call it, or something. This is
kids always saying that.
Kids always saying tongue baths. We're going to be talking about the journalism that he's been doing about Tim Pool, because a lot of times when you're falling apart up here, you fall apart down there.
Oh yeah.
So
mind-body connection.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you want to become a member of the program, join themajorityreport.com. Join themajorityreport.com. Also, don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, hot chocolate. Get coupon code majority, 10% off. You can get the Majority Report blend. But that 10% off is good for any of them. And it's not just the first time you go. It's any time you go there.
Wow.
Justcoffee.coop. Emma.
ESPN. We'll be speaking
There's
about...
a big football game on Sunday.
Oh, yes. Yes, I've heard about it. We'll talk a bit about the Super
Big
Bowl.
Big psyop on Sunday.
Some of the controversy.
That's crazy.
What'd you say?
Yeah, it's
crazy.
I
said the Sunday psyop, more like
Oh, yes. I know. We'll see. I mean, we already know who's going to win. We'll talk a bit more about that, the Dan Quinn hire. And then I'm also just going to dip my toe into the NBA ahead of the trade deadline.
Can I just say about the who's going to win thing in the Super Bowl? If Travis Kelce, Mr. Pfizer wins, then it's because they want him to win so he can promote Taylor Swift, who can promote the Democrats. If
the
they
storm
lose,
is coming. Okay, what happens
if they lose, then it's because they want America to feel sorry for Travis Kelce, aka Mr. Pfizer, and Taylor Swift for when they endorse Joe Biden and the Democrats.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll keep track of it.
ESPN.
I'll keep on that on ESPN. Although I won't say who I think is going to win. I'll keep that for Thursday. YouTube.com/ESPN show. But I mean, I already got the script from from MSNBC. So
On the whole Taylor Swift thing?
On who's going to win the Super Bowl. I just will have to keep my cards close to the vest.
Like
for a
that's
little while.
MSNBC trusted with that. Like not even NBC. Just
Right, but that's our benefactor.
of course. Yeah,
obviously.
Punching.
Yeah.
Over there.
You know what we need is one of those, what is it, Unusual Whales? That Twitter feed?
The disclosures?
Yeah, but for Emma's Predict It or Trade Sports.
Oh, yeah.
Because she's got the inside dope on what's happening with the Super Bowl because Taylor Swift's involvement. And if you shadowed her bets.
Right. Many people are calling her the Nancy Pelosi of the NFL.
You're the Nancy Pelosi in that.
Oh, sorry. I mean, many people are calling me that. Yeah.
She wouldn't be coming
Dave
to
the
work.
Apprentice wants me to give you a kudos on flushing the hatchet.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, thank you. I try.
Yeah.
Poetic.
Matt.
Yeah, on Sunday for patrons of Left Reckoning, we talked to Chip Gibbons of Defending Rights and Dissent about Nancy Pelosi's the whole thing about protesters and the dark history of saying anti-war protesters are agents of a foreign government, and also talking about the ICJ case. So check that out, patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Denner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males
psych. Fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank.